Chasing Leviathan is a podcast about pursuing truth, one big question at a time through the discipline of listening. Truth is too big to tame, but if we pay close attention, we might get the chance to glimpse something truly magnificent. So please join me in this pursuit, 1 week at a time. Hello, and welcome to Chasing Leviathan. I'm your host, PJ Weary, and I'm here today with Dr. John Colman, Associate Professor of Politics at Ave Maria University, and we're talking about his book, Everyone Orthodox to Themselves, John Locke and His American Students on Religion and Liberal Society. Dr. Colman, wonderful to have you here today.
Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Just from the get-go, what led you to write this book?
Well, a few things. Some of my previous work was on Lucretius and Epicureanism, and in the course of researching for that book, I came into contact with some of Jefferson's letters, and Jefferson talking about his own Epicureanism. And in the course of some of that, I got interested in Jefferson's own views about materialism and its relationship to Christianity and his own belief. And then from there, I started looking at some of the other founders. But I think in terms of our contemporary debates, one of the things that has come up, recently, it's not an entirely new topic, is a debate about the place of Christianity in American life, its civic function, and the degree to which both the American founding is influenced by Christianity in the West has been, marked by Christianity as well. And it seemed to me, at least in a lot of these debates, what kind of Christianity was never really asked. That it was always assumed that everybody knew what Christianity meant, and that Christianity was some sort of static thing that's unchanging. I mean, everybody's aware that there are lots of different Protestant denominations and the divisions between Catholics and Protestants. But I think in some regard, this question of what form of Christianity was one that needed to be explored a little bit more fully. So that was at least part of the initial motivation for the beginning of the research.
And at that time, when the United States was taking shape, what would you say are the dominant forms of Christianity that, if there were kind of like major strands? Obviously, even as you talk about these different thinkers in your book, they're going to have very idiosyncratic individual views. But what were the major strands at the time?
Well, I guess if you go back to early colonial America and say, the Puritan, you're from New England, and so
yes,
John Winthrop's version of Christianity and say traditional Anglicanism, sort of high church Anglicanism. And it didn't take long from say 1630 through to the end of the 17th century going forward that as America became increasingly populous, there was a wide variety of different religious denominations. But at least to a certain extent, in the earliest days of colonial America, it was generally thought across the 13 colonies that Christianity was an important, not just system of religious belief, but played a very vital role in the encouragement of certain kinds of virtues that were necessary for government. And so one way to think about Christianity, at least in the earliest days, is there's this tradition of thinking of the relationship between church and state that in some ways is what was at times referred to as the nursing father state, that the state had to in some way attempt within certain prudential limits to put the principles of Christianity into its law, that there's no separation of church and state as we understand it, that it was the case that most Christians thought that the church and state had somewhat separate realms, but though there was an interplay between those realms, and that one's politics had to be informed by Christianity. Now, how people defined it was obviously different from one denomination to the next, but on the whole, it was generally thought that Christianity should be privileged by the state. And so if you look at a lot of the early, even after we win our independence, the early state constitutions, there's various forms of established churches. In the case of Virginia, the Anglican Church, all the states in some way, if they didn't have a kind of hard establishment, had some language in their constitutions that stipulated that those who would serve in the legislative branch should be of a certain Protestant persuasion more often than not, right? Believe in certain doctrines or profess the truth of the Bible, so on and so forth. And so, trying to pinpoint like what is the dominant strain as in terms of denominations is difficult, but there is a largely shared view that Christianity has an important political role to play in the country and that it should be privileged.
And did you call that the nursing father state?
Yeah, in some instances, this is how it's often characterized, that the state is in some way a vehicle for the inculcation of certain Christian virtues. And so you would have blasphemy laws in lots of places, other kinds of laws. In Massachusetts, I went to Boston College. I remember when I first got there, you couldn't buy beer on Sundays, and there was these sorts of laws. Driving from Ohio to Florida, where I currently work, I remember stopping in Georgia on a Sunday on the move down. You weren't allowed to buy a beer, and so you have Sunday closings for shopping and things like that, sometimes referred to as blue laws. And so, the country had across it a certain shared understanding that Christianity was an important facet, not just in terms of the larger culture, but in terms of how the law ought to give direction to people's lives.
Now, even as you were talking about writing this, I think this is a rather obvious link, but I'd love for you to share it with us. I remember the first time I found out that Thomas Jefferson's Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness was a rephrasing of John Locke's Life, Liberty, and Property. But if you could kind of elaborate for us, obviously we're talking about the American students. Talk about that movement from Thomas Jefferson to John Locke for you.
Okay. My book doesn't want to establish that Locke's the only or even the dominant strain of thought. And there's a debate, and we often talk about the American founders as though they're a sort of monolithic group. But the three founders that I'm dealing with in my book, Madison, Jefferson, and Franklin, I would admit that they are perhaps more radical than a lot of their contemporaries. Not all the founders shared the same views in terms of the place of religion in American life or had the same religious sensibilities. But at least with regards to Jefferson, Jefferson was very much influenced by the thinking of Locke, as you mentioned. We have his notes on the letter concerning toleration that went into the creation of things like the Declaration and more importantly the Virginia Statute for Religious Liberty. And if you go to Monticello today and you go into his living room, if you want to call it that, there's a portrait that he had commissioned, and you can see it on the wall. The three greatest men that ever lived, and there are three faces in the painting. John Locke is one of them. The other two is Sir Francis Bacon and Sir Isaac Newton. And so Jefferson's thinking about religion, religious toleration, and politics was deeply influenced by Locke. And in terms of Locke's wider influence, it's a question about how broadly something like the Second Treatise on Government got read, but his essay concerning human understanding was a deeply influential work for people like Jefferson as well. And so his writings on epistemology, his writings on religion were very much widely read, at least within the circle of founders that I'm talking about. And so Jefferson, interestingly, in the letter concerning toleration, this is one example. Locke famously excludes atheists and Catholics from the circle of toleration. And in the margins or in Jefferson's own notes, he writes in regard to this exclusion, he says that where Locke stopped, we can go on. In other words, Jefferson doesn't exclude Catholics or atheists. He has some issues with Catholics, as many Protestants had in the period, not necessarily for their religious beliefs, but they thought that they're like Locke did, that Catholic allegiances were split, just like Kennedy had to defend himself when he was running for president, that they have two heads of state, the Pope on the one hand and the Constitution on the other. Now, obviously, anti-Catholic bigotry has thankfully ended and collapsed in the 1960s, but this was a form of bigotry that Jefferson himself sometimes fell into. But he was willing to extend religious toleration to all the atheists, Catholics, pagans, you name it.
And that even as I look at the very end, and it's talking about affording religious liberty to people whose views would not harm you.
Yes.
Right. It's interesting because there is a certain strand of Catholic thought that gives the sword to the church. I wouldn't say it's the dominant strand, but you do see that argument, and that's obviously plays into this sort of thing, right?
Yeah, and then there's that great line in the notes on Virginia where Jefferson says that it makes no difference whether his neighbor believes in no God or 20 gods. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. In other words, your neighbor's religious opinions, as long as they're not trying to steal your stuff or harm you, you should leave them alone. It's really none of your business what your neighbor believes in religiously. At least, and I think this is an important facet of the way that Locke and Jefferson and Madison and Franklin think about religion. There's two, we might say, roughly speaking, there are two parts to religion. There's what we call the orthodoxy, the set of beliefs that a particular religious denomination ascribes to, and then the moral teaching. So we have Christ's moral teaching on the one hand, and we have a variety of doctrines and dogmas relating to his divinity, the concept of the Trinity, notions of grace, all these other doctrinal matters. And for Locke and Jefferson, they thought that you could separate the morality from the doctrine, that the doctrine was getting in the way of the morality, and that what's happened, at least as they saw it, was that the concentration on doctrine actually led people not only to ignore the virtues or the moral teachings of Christ, but that it actually led people to violate those virtues, that they were willing to put up with all sorts of violence in the name of religion. But what Locke said is, how can you say you're a Christian if on the one hand you say, these are the moral teachings that Christ gave to us, but then put those aside and engage in all sorts of persecutions in the name of doctrinal conformity and of so-called orthodoxy. And so to that extent, what we see with Madison and Franklin and Locke and Jefferson is a desire to try to, or a hope that Christianity will be transformed whereby the doctrinal stuff won't matter. The only thing that will matter is whether or not someone lives in accord with the moral teachings of Christ. And so when he says, it doesn't matter to me whether my neighbor believes in one God or no God or 20 gods or whatever it happens to be, it neither picks my pocket or breaks my leg. If somebody is acting morally, then you should not worry about their doctrinal beliefs. Those are immaterial. And so they thought that you could separate these two things out, and that if we could more or less get rid of a lot of the doctrinal stuff, then the moral principles would shine all the more beautifully, and we wouldn't have all this division and sectarianism and the violence that came with religious sectarianism, that we could simply look at Christ as a moral reformer, as a moral teacher. And so that was what Christianity was for Jefferson. He in a letter, he said, I'm a Christian in the only way that Christ intended. And Jefferson didn't believe in the resurrection. He didn't believe in it in Christ's divinity. He didn't believe in I don't think he believed in the immortality of the soul, but that's a question. But a lot of the same is true with Locke as well. The letter concerning toleration, and then his more extensive work in the reasonableness of Christianity, is an attempt to, in some way, argue that a Christian is one who lives in accordance as best they can, repenting of the failures when they do fail, to abide by Christ's moral teaching. And so, if you're a moral person, then you should be thought of as a Christian.
Splitting different types of knowledge, I think a lot of people would see that if they think through it as difficult. But I do see, for our audience, can you talk a little bit about that backdrop of them responding to Spinoza and to Descartes, who in turn were responding to, in a lot of ways, the 100 Years' War, but also just the pure persecution on the European continent?
Yeah, there's been some interesting books done about Spinoza's influence on America. The one that comes to mind, I'm blanking on, America's God. I can't remember the exact title, but it was Matthew Stewart that wrote it. I'm not too familiar with a lot of Spinoza's influence, but it's certainly the case that, for Locke is writing at the end of the 17th century. So the reasonableness of Christianity comes out in 1695. And the letter concerning toleration is 1689. And there's still a considerable amount of religious persecution going on in Locke's own time. Locke was often suspected by people who knew him in England of being heretic at a minimum, and perhaps being worse than heretical in some respects. And so religious persecution is not something that they were unfamiliar with. They're not living that far away from the religious wars that decimated European societies. And even if you go to some of the earliest letters that James Madison writes, there are a couple letters to his friend William Bradford where he complains about the persecution of Virginia Baptists. And in these letters, he suggests that this kind of persecution is going to have to end, and he sort of longs for a kind of a day in which there'll be genuine religious liberty in at least at that time in the colony of Virginia. So I couldn't really speak to say Jefferson's reading of Spinoza. I don't know how well read in Spinoza he would have been. It's certainly the case that he was very much interested in material science, and believed that materialism, if it would, he was confident that more and more people would become materialistic over time, because that's where the science was leading. That materialism would get rid of a lot of the superstition he saw in religious matters. There's a rather, I recount this in the book, a kind of funny, somewhat funny story. Towards the end of his life, he received a book from the Marquis de Lafayette, the famous Marquis de Lafayette, who played a role in the American Revolution, written by a Frenchman named Pierre Flourens. And Flourens had been doing experiments on pigeons. And what Flourens did was he separated the cerebrum from the cerebellum of a pigeon. And he found that you could actually take this portion of the brain out, then the animal would lose a lot of its senses, but it could still live somehow. And Flourens and Jefferson thought this proved the material basis of thought. And so it had lots of sort of metaphysical implications about the immortality of the soul and the nature of religious belief, so on and so forth. And so the advances in science and material science, particularly in the case of Jefferson anyway, was what he thought was going to be a major vehicle for the changing of Christianity away from what he thought were metaphysical abstractions towards this more, what he sometimes referred to as the original primitive Christianity which is simply Christ's moral teaching. And so, yes, as far as, say, Descartes and Newton and Francis Bacon are concerned, this was at least part of what Jefferson saw as the advancement of science. Just like that, you perhaps are familiar with one of his last letters to Roger Whiteman when he gets invited to the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. He's an old man; he can't travel anymore. But he mentions to Whiteman that he wished he could be there, and he sort of summarizes what he thinks the Declaration will mean for America, and he talks about the way in which science will essentially triumph over monkish ignorance and superstition, the lights of science. And so this is at least partly Jefferson's hope.
One, I found it's Nature's God, The Heretical Origins of the American Republic by Matthew Stewart.
Yes, that's it.
It looks really fascinating. And I said 100 Years' War. I meant the wars of religion. Excuse me for that's what happens when you speak outside your expertise.
No, that's right. I understood what you were referring to. Yes.
But I mean, and that's where you have a lot of Descartes. I do know that's a lot of Descartes, and Spinoza's response is to, it's just so different even now today when we've lived in a society where, like, I mean, if you believe something, if you're not harming anybody, we take that for granted. But that was revolutionary for the time, literally revolutionary.
Yeah, no, that's true. And so, we have lots of contemporary arguments about, worries about the decline of more traditional forms of Christianity, the rise of the so-called nuns, the NONES, and what's happening, in terms of American religiosity. And there are some who argue that what we need to do is return to more orthodox forms of faith. And I think that, in some respects, we have to think about what exactly was responsible, at least on the religious side, to the wars of religion, because they're not simply wars of religion. There is a political element to it. But on the religious side, it's certainly the case that doctrinal conformity and claims about orthodoxy had the effect, at least in the minds of people like Locke, of setting us at odds with each other and, unfortunately, excusing a lot of rather terrible behavior between religious people. And so I think, for those who are calling for more orthodox forms of faith, I think we ought to, revisit the question of what that form of religiosity meant politically in terms of a greater toleration and the manner in which Christians came to put aside their differences and not concern themselves so much with the beliefs of their neighbors, like Jefferson. And so that's one aspect. I'm not sure, if you've been following any of the debates on the sort of post-liberal front. There's Patrick Deneen and Sohrab Ahmari and a few other Catholic intellectuals have been arguing for an overthrow of the modern liberal order, and at least in some circles, there's a desire to return to something of a much more robust confessional type state, that we ought to get rid of get rid of the First Amendment and have established churches and things like that. And then there's another strand of this that comes up, at least when dealing with America. There's been a number of books that came out within the last couple of years, one by a man named Mark David Hall, who's a very interesting scholar in lots of respects, who wrote a book, Did America Have a Christian Founding? And he said that Orthodox Christian beliefs were instrumental in the creation of the American founding. Or Larry Siedentop's book on inventing the individual, Tom Holland's book, Dominion. There was another book written by a very good scholar of Christian history, Robert Wilkin, about the origins of religious liberty in Christianity. And it's hard for me, at least, to see how how the same Christianity that justified religious persecution, that justified, a kind of politics that was not terribly interested in the voices of the so-called people, could then give rise to religious toleration, could then give rise to the ideas of separation of church and state and the like. I know some people don't care for that formulation, but something happened to Christianity between, say, what you mentioned in the wars of religion and then today, right? We're not pulling our neighbors out of their homes to interrogate them about their religious opinions. We're not fearful, at least, and we're, for the most part, not terribly concerned about neighbors' religious opinions. It would be unthinkable to, say, kill one's fellow citizens in the name of doctrinal difference. And so something's happened. And the question that at least my book hopes to begin to spell out is, what happened? Well, there was some kind of transformation in the way that people read their Bibles.
I think, and this may be beyond the purview of the interview, so if you don't want to dig too far into this, I understand. Something that's fascinating to me is, what is the purpose of politics and what is the purpose of religion, and what are the mechanisms by which they attain those purposes? What are the powers of religion and what are the powers of politics? What are their structures, and what's the value of these things, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of our politics, what politics is meant to do has changed over time, right? It's at least our politics, if we stick with, say, the plain language of the Declaration of Independence, that politics in some ways is to create the conditions whereby our natural rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, can be protected. Those aren't rights given to us by government. Government has the job of making sure that those rights are not trampled upon by either our fellow citizens or by the state itself. Religion has its goal, the leading men to their ultimate end, which is their salvation. Now, for a long time, that idea that the state is to protect our inalienable rights was not even dreamed of, or was in some way subordinate to the idea that the state can assist man in arriving at his end. And so the state would be in some way a kind of arm of the church that, by passing laws that encourage us towards the virtues that allow us to be living godly lives, the state could do its service to the church as well. So John Winthrop, the one-time governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, argued in a piece called on Christian Charity that the end of the state is in many ways to assist us in achieving our salvation. And so when it came to liberty, Winthrop argued we have the freedom to do what is good, what is just, and what is honest. Now, what is good, what is just, and what is honest is in many ways the subject of debate. And so by the time we get to the 18th century and the late 17th century, people are reconceiving government in very different terms. That if you try to put into the state the idea that man's highest end, his greatest good, or his salvation is to be worked upon by the state, you end up with the kinds of controversies and the kinds of conflicts that we were talking about a moment ago. And so, beginning with people like Thomas Hobbes and John Locke and others, the thought was that the state ought only really to take care of the needs of the body. That this is what Locke argues in the letter concerning toleration. Matters pertaining to man's end and the good of man's soul, those should be handled either privately by the individual or with the help of churches and communities and things. But the state itself should be largely neutral with regards to man's end. That the state doesn't care whether you get to heaven or not. And so politics and the ends of politics and the ends of religion were separated in that respect. But that's not to say, that this is always going to work for those who are more religiously inclined, or there are some who argue that this separation has created a certain kind of disorder in people's lives, insofar as they would argue, in order to live well, we really do need the assistance of law. That they would argue that the average person takes their moral direction in some sense from the laws themselves. So take something, we're experimenting in this country with the weed legalization. Now, once the law is no longer judging weed to be a prohibited substance, do we then say, well, it's okay to smoke weed? Well, one argument would be, well, if the law doesn't say it's bad, then it's not bad. And so the law ought to, prohibit certain kinds of things simply because the law serves as a kind of moral guide. And so, this idea that the state, by way of laws, can assist us in living a morally upright life is something that a number of critics of the more, say, small L libertarian or small state are concerned about. And so we're, at least in some circles on the right in America, we're having a debate again about whether or not we ought to have a system of laws that is not simply indifferent to man's end.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Even as you're talking, our family has grown dramatically in the last year. We went from 2 to 5. So very exciting.
Congratulations.
But yes, thank you. So we, even as you're talking about this, one of the things that is a marker of a lot of these discussions has to do with the distinction between negative and positive laws that prescribe things and laws that proscribe things. And when you deal with children, it becomes immediately apparent in ways that the government has learned about people that even laws that are quote unquote negative often have these sorts of positive effects. And I think we see that, and that has become more and more of the question of our day, is that we have tried to do just like we will not do harm, but what we have are, I believe it was someone critiquing Milton Friedman that I saw talking about this, but if you have a transaction between two people and they succeed, there may be a third person, I can't remember the technical economic term, but there are unintended consequences that can harm the community as a whole. And that's kind of what we're running into, especially as we see more globalization and we have more complex systems with lots more unintended consequences. Things like climate change, for instance, all of a sudden, like prescription and proscription become much more complicated.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. And I think what a lot of people tend to, perhaps, at least in our larger political culture, we tend to be far too ideological and not prudential enough. That there's lots of unintended consequences in political life. It's simply in a country as large and diverse and as complex as the one in which we live. There's always going to be unintended consequences, and so. What exactly will the law do is often not known in advance. And so, I don't think that we ought to be jailing people for weed possession. But then again, I'm not so sure. I think it's a great idea to sell weed sort of at every 7-Eleven in the country or something, or at every on every street corner without legal penalty. But I don't have any hard and fast ideas about this. But the difference between prohibition and, say, permission, it's not simply a mere legal matter. We have to think about what are the long-term consequences for communities, for individuals. And, it could very well be the case that a lot of the things that we think of as necessary in the name of freedom will have unintended consequences that actually detract from a lot of people's freedom. And so how to in some way think about the law in a complex society like our own requires a great deal of prudence, that it's not simply a question of permission or prohibition. We have to think of more imaginative ways of trying to deal with certain kinds of effects that freedom necessarily involves. So like you were saying with climate change or environmental degradation and the like, you can prohibit all sorts of things in the name of trying to preserve the environment, but we got to make sure that whatever policies we put into place, they actually work, rather than simply some sort of kind of virtue signaling, so that we feel like we're doing the right thing, so to speak. I remember there was a period they got rid of the straws, and you had to drink your drink out of this nasty little paper straw. I mean, is there any evidence whatsoever that someone in a Wendy's in Columbus, Ohio, using a plastic straw is going to have any effect on the environment whatsoever? Is it, there was some woman that impaled herself on a metal straw. I saw a story about because they couldn't get in plastic straws. But these are sort of ridiculous examples. But we tend to think in ways that are far more ideological and partisan than in terms of just a prudent approach to a lot of the issues that we have to deal with collectively across party lines. And religion is one of them, I would say, as well.
Yeah, even as you talk about that, one of the unfortunate consequences of a representational form of government, not that I'm against that, I am very happy to have representation, but one of the problems with it is that the appearance of action is often more important than the action itself. And to speak to what you're saying, and forgive me, I've been sitting on this for 10 minutes, but it sounds like with weed, you want to set the bar for highs just a little bit higher. So that's... I couldn't resist.
No, that's fine.
But I'm really interested in this idea, and maybe this is a good segue into Ben Franklin, because I know this is the sort of thing he was really interested in. But when you talk about prudence, can you explain a little bit more how the government could show a little bit more prudence of its own, and maybe even produce that in its own citizens? As you talk about good citizens, not good Presbyterians. I've never said this on the show, but I go to a Presbyterian church. So that's like that title stuck out to me. I really enjoyed that.
Yeah. I mean, how to get, well, I think we need better politicians in a lot of ways. The primary system has failed miserably. And, returning more power to the parties probably would have kept some of the worst kinds of candidates out of the public eye. But whether or not we'll ever see any sort of reform of the manner in which the parties choose their candidates is hard to know. But a number of things could help in terms of just the way that politicians are operating. Two things at least stand out to me. One is we have increased the power of the executive branch through the administrative state in ways that violate the Constitution and make a mockery of the separation of powers. And so returning a lot more oversight to Congress. A lot of people in Congress are more than happy to allow the executive branch and the administrative agencies to make all these decisions, because it allows them, one, to not have to take any responsibility for decisions they would have to make, and two, then if anything goes badly, they can blame the president, right? Oh, it's Joe Biden or it's whoever happens to be running the executive branch at the time. And so members of Congress have lost an enormous amount of ambition in preserving the prerogatives of their own branches, and so they've happily gone along with allowing the executive branch to assume their own power. So some resurgence of congressional oversight over the executive branch and the administrative agencies in particular would be very, very helpful. The other thing I think is that, and I don't know how you solve this problem, there's a kind of revolving door between Congress and the media, and that too many members of Congress are really only interested in getting on TV. And so to the degree that our media landscape has created sort of minor celebrities out of, frankly, some of the most dim-witted people ever to serve an elective office is rather astonishing. And this is true on both sides of the aisle. I mean, Marjorie Taylor Greene and any number, the list, the list as well as I do. How these people get elevated into office and then become minor celebrities is rather astonishing. But that's just the way Twitter and 24-hour news operates. And so, how do you return to a kind of prudence? Well, I think members of Congress are in need of a kind of institutional discipline, and to the extent that hopefully the courts will revisit some of the what's essentially been the delegation of congressional power to the executive branch. Hopefully, we'll see some of that. There are some signs that the courts might strike down some of the independent power of the agency. So that's one thing. And in terms of Franklin, what would Benjamin Franklin say about all of this? Well, it might be apocryphal, but as Franklin said when asked when he was leaving the constitutional convention in Philadelphia, there's this story that some woman came up to Franklin and said, "Oh, Dr. Franklin, what kind of government have you given us?" And he said to them, "A republic if you can keep it." But that I think from Franklin's point of view, that would have as much to do with the people of America as with the politicians. He's addressing, at least in this, it's not clear whether it's an apocryphal story, but he's addressing some woman, some independent woman, a republic if you can keep it. In other words, if we can keep it. So, we have to, the citizens of America have to do a better job in terms of thinking clearly about politics and being more civically minded. And I think Washington could do a lot if we return to a much more robust system of federalism, that citizens aren't engaged on the local level or even on the state level nearly as much as they could otherwise be. And so you've had 3 children recently?
We just added 2 foster children who were related to. So yes,
yeah, beautiful.
Yeah,
that's
and
nice.
Had one. Yes, yeah.
That's awesome. But once you have children, and I would think what the school system looks like suddenly becomes a concern, right? You buy a house, and what the property taxes look like becomes a concern. And so the more people are sort of engaged on the local level, the more civic minded they are, the more we can deal with our politics in both a sort of serious and prudential way. And all politics seems to have gravitated up from the local level to the state level and then to Washington, and nobody pays attention. And so we could probably have a much more engaged, citizenry if we returned a lot of power that has gravitated up in the system down to the bottom. That this is one of the things that Tocqueville, Alexis de Tocqueville, looking at America in the 1830s, admired so much, especially about your native part of the country, is the system of townships, how engaged Americans were on the local level in their politics. And people will be engaged if important stuff happens on the local level. And if Washington takes the important stuff, or I'm in Florida, if Tallahassee takes the important stuff that happens on the level of the counties, then people won't be that interested. They won't pay attention. And so we need to devolve power once again to the local level, and that might bring people out and be more serious about politics.
When you talk about laws that shape people, is there a way without perhaps proscribing people's beliefs that you could prescribe prudence? Is there a way that the government can help? One is obviously adding responsibility in the way you said. Like, if you give people responsibility, they will rise to it. Sometimes they won't. But
Sure.
yeah, I mean, you can't rise to something you don't have. But also, is there a way of just driving prudence in our society? Is there something that the government could do to increase that?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I mean, I think, again, for me anyway, the degree to which politics is handled on the local level, where people are more directly engaged, they're going to have to take more ownership of over the people they elect, and more ownership over the decisions that get made. And it will, I would think, change people's habits in terms of thinking about politics. If I think on the national level, people can elect some of the crazier people in Congress as a kind of lark almost. That who cares if this one lunatic gets in? It sends a message to whoever you're going to own the libs or whatever you're going to do, and that you don't. It's not a really serious thing, because who knows who going to take responsibility for having that person in Congress. But if you do it in your hometown, if you elect a bunch of lunatics in your hometown, well, then suddenly those people start to make decisions that are destructive of that hometown. It's not such a lark anymore. You now have to deal with the consequences of your own decisions, perhaps. But how could the government make us more prudential? That's a hard thing to know. Yeah.
Well,
But
even as you said that, like, I mean, if you're one of 100,000 votes that won one electoral vote and they win by 50, versus like you're one of 20 votes that got someone voted into your township, you're all of a sudden like, oh, that was my bad. Yeah, that was.
Yeah, exactly. And just leaving things to be done on a more local level. That if decisions are made that impact your life, and you're aware of where those decisions are being made, not only will you pay closer attention, but you'll have to own your own vote in a way that perhaps you don't have. And to the degree that government is increasingly taking care of us from cradle to grave, it also encourages perhaps a lack of thoughtfulness in the citizenry. That we have to be able to be self-governing in a sort of meaningful sense. But if the state is going to have continuous sort of arms around us to protect us from all manner of things, I think it infantilizes people. And so, what that looks like in practice is perhaps hard to define, but it doesn't seem that we're doing a lot to encourage a kind of civic responsibility in this country very often.
I see you kind of start with this theology of liberalism with Locke, and then you end with Jefferson's materialism. What are the connections you see between materialism and liberalism, or if you see any?
Well, I'm not. I think for Jefferson and Locke, the question of the material, at least in Jefferson, and you can see this in Locke as well, it's a question that gets raised. The notion of the material basis of thought. Part of this, at least for Jefferson, was that certain non-materialist ideas about man, about God, about the human condition, led men away from a kind of rational explanation of how the world works and why the human condition is the way it is. And so the materialism is in some way a substitute in Jefferson's frame of mind for a heightened rationalism, that reason should govern things rather than, say, certain spiritual notions or what he calls immaterial notions. And Locke, similarly, when you look at his religious writings, he frequently points to superstition as being a problem. And superstition is based upon certain notion that there are immaterial things that exist that don't, in fact, exist. And that if we were disabused of these ideas, we would come to a more rational and at least in Locke's mind, reasonable assessment of how the world works and the manner that it works, and we can take greater accounting of these things and therefore order our affairs in a more reasonable fashion as well. And so the materialism, at least as Jefferson talks about it, has to do with that. What exactly is the nature of the human soul? How exactly is it that we come to possess the kinds of thoughts that we possess? There's an interesting idea that Jefferson puts at the very beginning of the Virginia statute for religious liberty, where he says something to the effect, and I'm sort of trying to remember it off the top of my head, but he says, well aware that the beliefs of men do not follow voluntarily of their own will, but I'm trying to remember the exact words, but the long and the short of that our minds are in some way the things that make up the things that we believe. So that what you believe religiously is not chosen, according to Jefferson. Jefferson and Madison and Franklin and Locke all make this claim that in some way the things that we believe, particularly with regards to religion, are not chosen in any sort of meaningful sense of the term. That what you believe is essentially what your mind has been convinced of. The evidence, you bring all this evidence into your mind through your senses and what you read and all of that. And then the mind makes up its decision as to what is compelling and what's not so compelling. And on that basis, what Jefferson wants to argue, and the importance of this idea is that the natural condition of human beings is one of religious diversity. That if it's not up to you to believe or not believe something, whether your mind believes it or not, then it's likely going to be the case that you, PJ, have very different religious beliefs from me, and my neighbor will have very different beliefs from them, so on and so on and so on. And so we can't necessarily control our religious beliefs. And in terms of the operations of the mind, this was important to them. And so if I could find the passage, I'd like to read it if I could find it off the top of my head. It's the first couple of lines of the Virginia statute for religious liberty.
Am I correct in thinking that this is in some ways a rebuttal to Pascal's wager?
Yeah, I think Jefferson would say, and I don't know this. I think Jefferson would say that's sort of ridiculous. That Pascal's wager doesn't make a lot of sense. That you can't believe something honestly just because you think it's going to be better for you to believe it than not believe it.
I have it, by the way.
Okay, it's the first line.
Well aware that the opinions and belief of men depend not on their own will, but follow involuntarily the evidence proposed to their minds, that Almighty God hath created the mind free and manifested his supreme will, that free it shall remain by making it altogether insusceptible of restraint. And he goes on.
Right. And so what's that mean, that your beliefs...
Oh, that's a long first line. Okay.
Yeah. Follows involuntarily the evidence proposed to your minds, right? So the only thing that you could... So that two things follow. One, the only thing you're allowed to use is persuasion, right? If you want to try to change someone's religious beliefs, you can't coerce them. The only thing you could try to do is persuade them. But there's a limit to what you could persuade people of, because their minds are of such an order that what's convincing to one person is not going to be convincing to another. Franklin, in some ways, has a similar remark in a letter to his mother. Franklin was defending a man named Samuel Hemphill, who was a Presbyterian minister that had been brought up by the Synod of Philadelphia for essentially blasphemy and heresy. And his mother Franklin's mother's back in Boston, is worried that Franklin's getting involved in this, and he says to his mother, after saying, I don't know what all these heresies have to do with, and I'm not involved in all of that. But he says he can't change his opinions more than he can change the nose on his face. And therefore, this idea that our opinions, and Locke says something very similarly, if our opinions are not simply chosen, then we can't be culpable for those opinions necessarily in any sort of meaningful way, right? You believe what you believe. And therefore, what Franklin says to his mother in the letter is, don't judge a person according to the things they believe. Judge a person according to the things that they do. If they act in a way that's decent, if they're morally virtuous and upright, then you shouldn't concern yourself with their religious opinions. And if they don't, well, then you can criticize them. But in that way, for Jefferson, not only is it the case that each of us has to, in some way, undergo our own investigation into the truth of things, that you have a responsibility to try to look into things as deeply as you can. You have control over what you put into your mind. You can read widely. You can listen to lots of different arguments. You can try to experience the world in its manifold beauty and ugliness. And then your mind will have a lot more information to form these opinions on. And you have a responsibility to do that. But what comes out of that at the end of the day is not simply up to you. If you have done everything you can to try to learn the truth about God, about the world, about man, about ethics, about politics, and all of these things, if you've done your duty, as he says, to try to learn as much, then you cannot be blamed for where you end up in lots of ways. And so this is true not only in politics, but in religion, it's particularly true. And so for Locke and Jefferson and Madison and Franklin, the one obligation we have to God is to try to learn the truth. And whether or not we come to know the full truth, that's hard to know. But if we've done that to the best of our ability, then we cannot be thought of as failing in our duties as rational creatures to God. And God won't blame us. They say that even if at the end of the day you don't believe the right things, but you've sought to try to in some way inform yourself, that'll be enough for God. And therefore your neighbors ought not concern themselves so long as you are living in an upright way.
Dr. Colman, it has been an absolute pleasure having you on. I want to be respectful of your time. As we wrap up here, what is one thing that you would leave for our audience to kind of take away and to think about and mull over, or maybe even do this week?
I think when it
no pressure, yeah.
When it comes to say our political debates and our religious debates, I think extending the other side a degree of charity is important. I think all too often we ascribe bad motives to people. And so we assume that people are out to destroy the republic. The left does it to the right does it to the left. The religious do it to the non-religious, and the non-religious do it to the religious. And there's an enormous lack of charity, it seems, that people sincerely believe the things that they believe. Now, there are some people who aren't very kind, that's true. But I think the average person in thinking about politics and thinking about religion genuinely wants to do what is best for themselves, for their family, for their country. And we disagree profoundly about a lot of things. And it's fine to disagree, but it's not good to, in some way, throw aspersions at people and try to, in some way, misrepresent why they think the things that they think. And so a kind of mutual charity and tolerance for one another would go a long way in reconciling a lot of the divisions we have in this country. That your political rivals are not your enemies. We are not, as Lincoln said, we are not enemies, but we are friends. And so I think our society could use a healthy injection of just good old fashioned Christian charity, and not leap to the conclusion that the people with whom you disagree are somehow evil or bad intentioned, I think would go some way. And I guess the other thing I would say is gratitude. We live in an extraordinarily wonderful country in a wonderful age. We are, despite all the problems that we have, whether they're environmental problems, the rising mental health problems, human beings have never lived as long, as healthy, had so much material prosperity, so much opportunity. We've never lived in a society that's as accepting in lots of ways as the one in which we currently live in. And we ought to be sort of supremely grateful to our fellow citizens, to the people who built this country for us. And we have a kind of obligation to future generations to at a minimum pass on our own gratitude to a degree. And so gratitude and charity, I think, would be high on my list of much needed virtues in our contemporary life. But we'll see how we go.
Well, I love that you ended with that, because that's even how you end your book. And I think this works for gratitude as well, that charity and gratitude are the offspring of humility. And yes. Just like and that's kind of even everything we've been talking about. That's like, you know what? Maybe I'm actually wrong about this. That's kind of the start, right? It's like, maybe you have something to teach me. Yeah.
Yes, that's right. If we just listen to each other a little bit, maybe we would have a lot to learn from each other. I suspect we would. But yeah, these old Christian virtues, especially humility, charity, gratitude, hope, seem to be in relatively short supply these days. But maybe we just need to be recalled to our senses somehow.
Well, and that's I love that you added hope there at the end, because that's what we. That's important for us to have, right? Like, it can be easy to be pessimistic. But it's been an absolute joy, Dr. Colman.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.